origin of religious confessions and forms of prayer. Humanity began with an all-encompassing basic view of the world, and according to the character of the peoples and the climatic conditions in which they lived, this worldview expressed itself differently in the various religious confessions. We find the basic spiritual scientific concepts in all religious formulas and confessions, just as we do in the Lord's Prayer. There may be those who say that they have been merely dreamed into the other religious confessions, but they are in fact present within them. But how did they get there? We must clearly understand that what we are taught today was not presented in the most ancient teachings in the same way. The forms of religious confessions were very different at various times. The oldest views speak in images, not in concepts as we do today. These pictures were maintained in a certain sense, and we encounter them again and again. Consequently, knowledge is constantly spoken of as quote-unquote light, and wisdom is referred to as the flow of quote-unquote water. Why were ancient people spoken to in images? We want to clarify how the religious leaders spoke to the various peoples before Hermes, Buddha, Zoroaster, and Moses, those who established the great religions before Christ. We must distinguish between ordinary consciousness and imaginative consciousness. From morning until evening, we have object-oriented, everyday consciousness. We see things as they are represented to our senses. Other states of consciousness are initially hidden from us. We have all heard of the state of dreamless sleep. It means something entirely different to initiates than it does to ordinary people. In the time between falling asleep and awaking, initiates are in a fully conscious state. Their perception of the world is entirely different from the usual. An ordinary person knows nothing of this state. Consciousness of dreaming sleep is more well known. Consequently, we will use dreaming sleep to explain dreamless sleep. Dreaming sleep shows everything in pictures. It is similar to the state of consciousness of initiates when they are in the spiritual world. Initiates also see images, but not those of chaotic dreams, though they do constantly change. On the physical level, each thing has only one form, for example, a table or a stone. As we ascend higher, however, more forms are caught up in transformation. The plant is shifted and transformed, and animals even more so. The human being is the most mobile and capable of transformation. Everything is continually caught up in transformation in Devakan. Footnote, Devakan is derived from a Sanskrit word meaning, quote, dwelling of the gods, unquote. In theosophy, it refers to an intermediate state between two earthly lives, into which the I being enters after separating from Kama-rupa, or subjective self, and the disintegration of the lower principles, following the death of the earthly physical body. End footnote. Through certain exercises, we may reach a point where when we observe a plant, its color separates from it and floats freely in space. Then we must learn to guide such freely floating colors as well as sounds to certain things and beings. The color becomes an expression of the inner life. The aura of human beings also works in color and form. The inner experience of the soul is expressed in the aura, which is never at rest. The aura is in eternal movement. Eternal movement is the essence of the higher world. This is why the spiritual world is so confusing to those entering it for the first time. What manifests according to the needs of the moment confuses the inexperienced. Spiritual beings cannot hide their soul life from those who see with spiritual eyes. Ordinary human beings must assess the inner life based on what is external, but in the spiritual world the inner life of every being is clear and openly visible. We are there, together with the innermost being of things. Currently, only initiates can attain this vision, initiates who can add the inside of things to their outside. Indeed, they do this consciously. Once, long ago, all human beings could attain this vision unconsciously. The more ancient the people, the less they were able to do what we can do. For example, they could not calculate or count, and they knew nothing of logic. This is the way it was during the middle of the Atlantean Age. Nevertheless, the Atlanteans had another capacity, For example, when they observed a plant, they could experience a very specific feeling arise within them. By comparison, our feelings are only pale shadows. The original Atlanteans did not see the color of images as clearly as we do. Atlanteans saw colors as a mist floating and rising from plants. Nor could they see the color of a crystal. They saw a luminous crown of colors around a ruby, for example, but the ruby itself was only an inner impression. Prior to that time, human beings did not even see the outlines of people, animals, and plants. When they saw approaching enemies, however, they appeared as brownish-red figures rising before them. A friend displayed a reddish-blue color. In this way they perceived the inner life in individual colors. If we go back even further in time, to the Lemurian era, we find that even will impulses were different. The will had a magical effect. It revealed its relationship with the forces of nature outside. If human beings placed their hands over a plant and allowed their will to work, the plant would then grow noticeably. Through the fact that human beings are closed off within their skin, their forces were separated from the forces of nature. The forces of thought least resemble nature. Even further back in time, there were beings who would have considered it nonsense to say, quote, "I comprehend a thought of something external," unquote. They saw the thought outside, working as a being. Originally, thoughts created the things. Today we see a clock and create for ourselves the thought of it, but we could never construct the clock as thought unless someone had created this thought before clocks existed, and then, following the thought, had constructed a clock. This holds true for thoughts of all things. The concepts that we create concerning the things of the world existed as realities in the most distant past. At that time, the concepts were laid into the things of the world. Everything comes into being following such thoughts or concepts, just as the creation of human beings happen today. Just as the creations of human beings happen today. Human beings at that time watched the master craftsmen of things, so to speak. They had a creative intellect. They were not yet incarnated in a body of flesh. What dwells today in the human body rested at that time in the womb of God. On earth below, physical life and beings existed as something between modern animals and human beings. They were mature enough to receive the human soul, which we can picture through the following image. If many little sponges are immersed in water, then every sponge absorbs drops of water, and the water is divided into nothing but individual drops. The physical earth, with its swarming multitude of beings, was at that time surrounded by a spiritual sheath, just as today we are surrounded by an envelope of air. Only then did individual souls begin to incarnate, when each being had absorbed a spiritual drop. Thus the process began through which the human being receives a self-enclosed, object-oriented consciousness. Before that time, the soul received everything from the soul of the world, quote, "from within outward," unquote, so to speak, since the world naturally knew everything. That is the difference between today's knowing and knowing at that time. Our inner world sinks into the darkness of dreamless sleep when our bright day consciousness enters. It is the astral body that perceives the external world. It sees colors, hears sounds, feels pleasure and pain, but it cannot do any of this without the physical body. The astral body is also the same as what was once the common substance of soul. If all human beings were to fall asleep at the same time, and their astral bodies mix with the universal world soul that did not sink into individual bodies, dreamless sleep would cease then, and colors and sounds would rise into the astral bodies, just as they once did when all souls still rested in the world soul. What we know as night today was once filled with light and perceptions of the spiritual world. All of humankind once perceived astrally in this way. What has humankind perceived since that time? What has the human being conquered since then? We have acquired I-awareness, the possibility of saying I of oneself. The entire consciousness of old was only an intensified dream consciousness. Human beings were unaware of themselves. Consciousness of self was given to human beings as they descended into their bodies. And this consciousness has continued to intensify. It makes up the content of our modern human evolution. Quote, I am the I am, unquote, has been revealed to human beings. That is the true name of Yahweh, or expressed in a longer form, quote, I am the one who was, who is, and who will be, unquote. In that ancient past, this consciousness was not present in the human being. Where was I-awareness at that time? It was present in that being in whom souls were contained like drops in water. The Holy Spirit is the one above who had the I-consciousness before the descent into bodies. It is the Spirit in itself that comes to I-consciousness in the human being. In those past ages, teaching was a pouring out of wisdom. It came from within, not from outside the human being. Between that age and ours there was an intervening age, the Atlantean epoch. In the middle of this age, human beings could begin to see the outlines of things and beings. Everything was still enveloped in a vague mist of color, penetrated by sounds that had something to say, sounds that were wise. A teaching arose at that time, which was developed later into religious teaching. Vast ages ago there was a great school of adepts there. All that we learn today began with them, the Turanian adepts. Footnote, the Turanians were a post-Atlantean people who lived north of Persia and into what is now Siberia. They, quote, saw into the spiritual world, were on familiar terms, so to speak, with spiritual beings, but were wanderers, having no inclination for work and without any interest in furthering culture in the physical world. End quote, Rudolf Steiner, The Gospel of St. Matthew. End footnote. It has been transmitted down through the ages to the present day. Teaching was very different than it is today. We must bear in mind that humanity was in a state of transition. The wisest of those people would be unable to count to 5. But if one focused on the inner life, one could enlighten them and teach them wisdom through imagery. One could not have explained a doctrine of wisdom to them. They would have failed to understand such a thing. The people of that time did not have the kind of clear day consciousness we have. Rather, they could return easily to a state where God could illuminate them from within. Teachers placed their students into a hypnotic state. It was not the same hypnosis with which so much nonsense is done today, but it was something similar. The teachers used this sleep state to enlighten their students. At that time they had an esoteric script or esoteric language. There are mantras today that contain more than their thought value alone, but compared to the sound and tone combinations of the past, they are mere shadows. These tone combinations were simple, but when such a tone was struck, it reinstated a lost capacity to illuminate. That world of inner enlightenment then entered human beings synthetically, and they could see the spirits of the world at work just as before. The disciples received formulas and certain signs from their teachers, and they then could perceive the secrets of the world directly. For example, this sign told them how a plant comes into being out of a seed, and it's essentially a spiral, spiraling in and then from in, spiraling out. It's a picture. If not explained, a modern person would neither think of anything in particular nor feel anything when viewing this sign. It directly affected the people of that age, however, when they saw it or when it was formed in front of them. The formulas used at that time were taught to the peoples who came later by the founders of religions. As we go farther back in time, the world soul was more unified. During sleep, the astral bodies of all human beings are still somewhat similar, but during the Atlantean age, astral bodies were always the same. One could bring to all people one primal wisdom. After the great flood had passed over Atlantean humanity, a unified wisdom was no longer possible. One had to teach in India according to what the Indian body required, differently in Persia, differently in Egypt, differently with the Greeks and Romans, and differently again with the ancient Germanic peoples, races. Nevertheless, within all true forms of religion, the common element from which each had arisen continued to live. In Atlantis, enlightenment meant imparting life, not teaching. The sign of the spiral awakened an immediate feeling sensation. Today, feelings must first be awakened by thoughts. The 7 petitions of the Lord's Prayer were also once given in the form of a scale of 7 tones, together with 7 specific colors and fragrances. In this way, disciples in Atlantis experienced the sevenfold essence of the human being. Christ, the greatest of the religious teachers, poured this into the Lord's Prayer. Everyone who prays the Lord's Prayer is affected by it. It is not really a mantra, though it may have mantric powers. It is a thought mantra. Of course, its greatest power was in the original human language, but because it is precisely a thought mantra, it will not lose its power even when translated into 1,000 languages. We can digest food without knowing the laws of digestion. Similarly, we have the fruit of the Lord's Prayer without knowledge. One who has the higher knowledge, however, will receive an entirely different fruit from it. Religious truths followed such paths. Our souls were all asleep at one time within the soul of the world, which was then divided into many members and drawn down to many bodies. Spiritual perception was darkened, as was the possibility of invoking the original state. Religious teachings are only a weak echo in thoughts and words, especially the religious forms and rules derived from the spiritual world. The wisdom of the Old Testament still speaks of ideas, even the original ideas. A dim reflection of the original ideas lives in these ideas, but that ancient wisdom is not lost, but still sleeps within our souls. Lifting it into clear consciousness is the task of spiritual science. After their final incarnation, when human beings have come to know all of the external world, they will be lifted to their original clairvoyance, bringing new enlightenment in clear consciousness with them. It is said in the East that salvation means complete absorption in the consciousness of the All, but that will not be. Before the first incarnation, there was no I awareness, but after the last incarnation, it will be present. Every single drop of the one, quote, soul fluid, unquote, is colored with its own very specific hue. In the end, all will bring their own colors, and the water that was once clear and bright will be shimmering with infinitely beautiful, luminous colors, each one present in and of itself. All will bring their own specific color, the individual consciousness that can never be lost. In the end, consciousness of the All will be the harmony of every consciousness. The many will become one, because in freedom they want to be one. We must imagine how it actually is. Every individual consciousness is contained entirely in the consciousness of the All. Human evolution is not without value. Indeed, life does have a meaning, and that most beautiful meaning is this: human beings will, in the end, lay upon the altar of the Godhead the portion of human existence that they have attained. From that will be made the garment that the spirit of the earth will weave. As Goethe says with such beauty and inspiration, quote, "In the flood of life, the flood of deeds, I float up and down, I weave back and forth, birth and grave, an eternal sea, a changing weaving, a glowing life. So I create on the whirring loom of time, weaving the living gown of the Godhead." End of footnote.